Today, my topic is socialism and calculation. And to begin, what I want to do is to point out a very important article. In fact, I think one of the best theoretical arguments or articles written in the 20th century. Okay, and that is Ludwig von Mises' Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth. That was published in 1920. It's available in a very fine edition here at the Mises Institute with, I might add, a noteworthy epilogue by a modern Austrian economist that points out that, in fact, Mises was not exaggerating when he said that socialism was impossible. He was right on target. Okay, so you might want to look at that. It's by Salerno. Okay. Okay. Let me begin by talking a little bit about the debate between socialists and anti-socialists prior to Mises' publishing of this article. What occurred was that back in the 19th century, there was controversy over socialism, and the controversy was between the classical economists, who are anti-socialists for the most part, and what were called the utopian socialists. Okay, and the utopian socialists were crazy. Each one had their own scheme. There was Charles Fourier, there was Saint-Simon, there was some British utopian socialists, and each one had their own plan about how to bring about utopia. Well, they were ridiculous plans. Charles Fourier, the Frenchman, claimed that under socialism, we're really not going to have to worry too much about production. He actually says in one of his books that the oceans will turn to lemonade, and that chickens fully roasted would fly right into our plates. Okay, he actually made that statement. Marx comes along and realizes that the socialists are losing the debate to the classical economists. Okay, basically the argument was over who will take out the garbage under socialism. That is to say, if everyone gets an equal share of the product, what is the incentive to do the dirty, dangerous, unhealthy jobs? Okay, who's going to go down into the mines, the bowels of the earth, and mine the coal? Who's going to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and pick up people's garbage, and so on? So the debate revolved around this very narrow question of incentives. What incentive is there? The classical economists pointed this out. The socialists came back, the utopian socialists, and claimed, well, there'll be a new socialist man emerging under socialism. Okay, someone who only worked for the greater good. Right? And they never explained how this new socialist man would emerge. You have the crazy plans, as I said, Fourier claiming that production will automatically take care of itself in some sense. And the second point of contention between the socialists and the anti-socialists was that of justice. That is, that people should earn or receive an income what they produce in some sense. That is what they earn. And it's unjust, according to the classical economists or anti-socialists, to redistribute wealth arbitrarily, okay, according to need. So it was basically this question of incentives that was debated, and of justice. Now Marx comes along and presents a brilliant ploy. What he says is these debates mean nothing. Okay, he wanted to discredit not only the classical economists but the utopian socialists because it was clear that they were crazy. So he says these utopian socialists are not scientific. He says under scientific socialism, that is Marx's brand of socialism, we cannot really know what the future will bring. Okay, we know that the forces of history, as surely as they brought about the death of the primitive collective economy called the gens, where everybody lived in sort of family-like communities, and gave rise to slave society in Greece and Rome. Okay, and then after that, as the forces of production developed, meaning technology and capital, okay, human action was not at the center of Marx's system. Okay, it was purely sort of technological-driven theory of history, or technology-driven theory of history. The slaves, as forces developed further, these productive forces, the slave societies collapsed, and we got feudalism. Okay, and then feudalism began to develop, we had inventions and technology and so on, and eventually feudalism could not stand against the forces of capitalism, which first emerged in the form of mercantilism, or high commercial capitalism of Venice and the Italian city-states, and then in mercantilism, centralized states in which businesses were given special privileges, and then finally the full industrial capitalism, which came about starting in the late 18th century. So Marx said, just as all of these other societies and modes of production have collapsed, so will capitalism, because each society contains within itself forces of contradiction that destroy it, okay, the thesis and the antithesis, as it's called in Marxian philosophy, and bring about a new synthesis. And this new synthesis is going to be socialism. And we don't have to, what we should restrict ourselves to doing as socialist theorists is to criticize capitalism, to show the forces of contradiction operating in capitalism, okay, bring about a further and further concentration of wealth in the hands of a few monopolists, until at the end, there's just a few monopolists and they're overthrown by the oppressed and immiserated, that is, poverty-stricken and falling to more poverty, the proletariat, okay? So, Marx said then, scientific socialists do not debate over socialism. We don't engage the people who are against socialism in debate. First of all, they're just sort of robots, just more or less echoing their class interests, and that class is going to pass away anyway. Okay? And secondly, the forces of history will unfold, and no matter what we think it's going to be like or what we do, it's coming. Okay? In the sense of the forces of nature, it's as inexorable as let's say the law of gravity. Okay, this law of pushing us towards socialism. So if you look at Marx's works, what is his main work entitled? Das Kapital, Capital. It's a critique of capitalism. He wrote very, very little on socialism. He wrote little on what the socialism of the past looked like, which he alleged to have existed in primitive times. Okay, and this was brilliant, because then other socialists shut up because they didn't want to be unscientific. They didn't want to start arguing and showing that they're utopians, okay, who have no clue about the force of history. And in a sense, even though the economists, of course, kept arguing about it, they were sort of shunted aside as marginal. Okay? They're unscientific. They're trying to predict the future, and they can't do that, and so on. Now, Mises comes along, okay? And after this debate sort of was dormant for a while, Mises comes along in 1920, in the great article I referred to, and points out that, in fact, there is an essential, central problem with socialism. And that is, if you define socialism, as Marx seemed to have done, and as almost all socialists have done, as collective or state ownership of the material means of production, meaning all the natural resources, all the capital goods, factories, means of transportation, raw materials, and so on, right? Then socialism faces a problem from which it can't escape. Okay, and what is that problem? The problem is, it's impossible to know your costs of production. It's impossible for the socialist central planner or the central planning board to know what goods to produce, in what quantities, and what technology to use. Now, why should that be the case? Well, Mises pointed out that if you look at a market economy, you have the profit and loss test, okay, to guide you in deciding what technology to choose and what goods to produce. That is to say, every single kind of factor of production, and by that I mean all resources, labor, land, and natural resources, they all have a price. So, for any conceivable production, for producing PCs or for producing completely new products, you will always know the cost in money terms of that product. And then you estimate, okay, what you think the price will be, and you compare it to the cost per unit, and that allows you to make a rational decision. Now, your decision may be wrong because you may very well be incorrect in predicting future consumer demand for the product and therefore the prices of the product. Okay? But you have a guide. And also, after you've produced the product, you can look back and you have a record of whether you were correct or whether you were wrong. That is, if you made profits or if you suffered losses. But Mises went on to say, under socialism, since the state owns all capital goods, okay, it abolishes all markets. There are no prices because there's no exchange. Factories, steel, computers, and so on, all those things cannot be exchanged because there's only one body or monopolist that owns all of them. So they can't calculate their costs. And if you can't calculate your costs, you can't figure out whether or not it's profitable to produce or how to allocate rationally various resources. Okay, I'll give you an example of that in a moment. So Mises pointed out that, in fact, you need economic calculation, whether under socialism or the market economy, in order to rationally allocate, in a modern industrial economy, the various scarce factors of production. Because remember, every time you use a factor, okay, a ton of steel, an hour of labor, to produce one thing, then you're giving up, sacrificing other things that could be produced. And under socialism, you don't know if those other things that you're sacrificing have a higher or lower value than what you are producing. So in effect, you're, as Mises once pointed out, you're like someone in the middle of a desert without a compass, okay, who can't orient himself or herself. Okay? They don't know in which direction to go. Let's say they want to go in the direction where the water is the closest, okay, in some sense. That would maximize their satisfaction. The socialist cannot do that because he doesn't have the compass to do that. Okay? So Mises said there are three institutional preconditions for economic calculation, for being able to calculate prices and costs of production and compare them. And they are private property, not just in consumer goods, because many socialists were willing to cede private property in consumer goods, okay? But in all, remember we talked about Menger, in all orders of goods, in goods at every stage of production, from mines and oil wells, okay, and land, all the way down to the factories and the various equipment in those factories that finally turn out the final or consumer's good. Secondly, there has to be a freedom to exchange. And for there to be a freedom of exchange, of course, there has to be more than one person or board that owns these various factors of production. If there's only one, then there are no markets. You can't exchange with yourself. Though later on the socialists try to come up with some scheme in which they try to obscure this and claim that, well, there is a way where you have a state controlling all of these things in which you can have trade, okay, and prices. But that's like me simply, playing a game where, I have these chairs and I have this overhead and I say, well, this overhead is worth 10 chairs. And then I exchange them, okay, with myself. That's just crazy, okay? That price, 10 chairs to one overhead, is meaningless. Now, we'll get to that. That's called market socialism, okay, which is really an oxymoron. And finally, sound money, okay? You must have a common medium of exchange, a general medium of exchange, which means that you have to have a commodity that exchanges not just for consumer goods, because that does exist under socialism, but for all orders of goods. There must be prices for everything, not just for consumers' goods. Okay. Now let me just give you then an example which shows sort of the crux of Mises's argument here, and then we'll come back to it again. Okay. Now, the problem with socialism, Mises pointed out, was not a lack of scientific knowledge or of technical knowledge. Mises assumed the best for the socialists. He assumed that they had competent engineers, competent scientists who knew the so-called production functions, meaning they knew all the different ways to make any given good. And let's say the socialist is determining whether or not he should make more automobiles. Okay? And just forget about what I've handwritten in here and just look at what the production function is. The engineers tell the socialist planner that we need P tons of steel, put whatever number you want in there, plus Q hours of machine time, plus R hours of unskilled labor, plus a certain number of hours of engineering labor. We also need some square feet of factory space, kilowatt hours, and managerial labor, and of course you need really thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of items to produce an automobile from scratch. But I'm simplifying it. And even under the simplified scenario, it's still impossible. All right, now all of those things added together gives you the automobile. When you combine them, and we're assuming they have the technological knowledge to combine them and to turn out a very fine automobile. Okay? Just like they had the ability, the Soviet Union, to turn out a rocket that would propel the first man-made satellite into space in 1958, Sputnik. Okay? They did that without any technical hitches. Whether or not that should be done, and by the way, whether or not NASA should be doing such things is besides the point. You have to know economic calculation. So the point is here then, okay, so they turn out this automobile. But the real economic question is not the way of turning it out, but it's, should we produce this automobile? Or let's say a factory that's going to turn out, let's say 10,000 automobiles per year. Should we produce it? Okay? Could those resources be used for things that are more valuable to consumers? Possibly constructing more apartment buildings, or using those resources to increase the number of motorcycles or bicycles in the economy. They have no clue. Why? Because how can you add tons of steel to hours of machine time, to hours of engineering labor, to square feet of factory space? There's no common unit. Okay? They're heterogeneous magnitudes. They can't be added up. You can't add them up and compare them to the automobile. Now, under capitalism, this is solved instantly. Okay? All of those things have a price, and those prices change from moment to moment. But at any moment in time, every single input in the market economy has a price. And it's priced in the general medium of exchange, the dollar. They can be added up, that is, the dollars spent on the inputs, and compared to the value of the automobile. Now, let's say that the inputs, including all resources owned by the firm, okay, even though they might not buy them, you can also attach a value to those resources. Let's say the firm owns its own factory. Okay, it has to attribute a certain amount of rent to that, but it can do that because it knows what factory space rents for. Because you have markets for every single input. So they add it up and they find out that it's $18,000. Now, the entrepreneurs, the price of the car today doesn't matter, okay? Because this production process may take 5 years, in the sense that from the time that a new model car is on the drawing board to when it comes to fruition, 5 to 7 years hence, you want to know what supply and demand and what the price of the car will be then. Now, entrepreneurs can make mistakes about that. That's why we have losses in the economy. That's why, for example, in 2006, GM lost $10 billion, biggest losses for any industrial company in history. Prior to that, in 1990 and 1991, those 2 years running, IBM lost $13 billion. Not because they can't calculate, but because the future is uncertain and entrepreneurs do make mistakes. But there's an incentive for avoiding those mistakes, and there's a test as to whether or not they've made mistakes. So what does this tell us? Let's assume they believe that a year from now, when the automobile is ready, the price will be $21,000. Well, then what's that telling them? That tells them that the alternative uses of all these things outside of the automobile industry is worth only $18,000 to consumers. Because who is bidding against them? Who else is trying to buy those things? Other entrepreneurs in other industries. But the fact that they're willing to pay the highest prices to get those things means that they must have a much higher value, or a higher value, in their own industry. So we know right away that resources are rationally allocated. In every single industry, at any moment in time, right now, okay, if you were to stop time and look at it, resources are allocated in a way by fallible entrepreneurs in a way that maximizes the expected future value of the products of those resources. Okay, so they are rationally allocated. Every resource, every unit of every resource is now working in a production process that is expected to turn out the highest valued goods. In that sense, the market economy is rational, okay, and rationally allocates resources. On the other hand, if that price happened to be $16,000, the expected price, then you would know, as an entrepreneur, that this is a bad investment. I'm not going to make this investment. So you know then that that $16,000 is a less valued product to consumers than the $18,000 you have to pay for those inputs because they are more valuable elsewhere. So you walk away from that investment project. Okay? So that's what economic calculation does. And by the way, all economic calculation has to be monetary calculation. There has to be a common denominator. And that's why money is called, at least according for Austrians, not only is it a general medium of exchange, a store of value, but it's also a unit of economic calculation. Now, there's another problem. What's the best way to build an automobile? Okay, we know that automobiles, when they were first being manufactured at the turn of the century, they were manufactured almost completely by hand, by craftsmen. Each automobile was done separately. There was no assembly line. Okay, so you had a lot of labor, and you didn't have many tools. The craftsmen worked making the parts themselves. They're usually in bicycle shops and in blacksmiths' garages and so on. And so they make each part, and they put them together by hand, and they sell the car. Now, they made about 2 cars a month that way. So you could make a car with a lot of labor and little land and little capital, or you can make it as we do here in the U.S., okay, with much more capital and fewer labors, the proportions at least, or you can make it with a completely robotized factory where you have 1 or 2 guys just monitoring computers and pushing buttons, okay, and robots are putting together the automobiles. So you can use a whole lot of capital. So there's many different ways to make automobiles and every other good. So it's another problem. How do we do it? Not just what do we produce, but once we decided, how do we produce? Well, let's say you want to use more hours of machine time and fewer hours of labor. So you add to the Q hours of machine time an extra number of hours, A, and so that is you introduce more machinery into your factory, and that allows you to spare labor, okay? You cut down on labor, you reduce the number of labors. Is that a good deal or a bad deal? To use more machinery. Well, do you know under socialism? No. You don't know if that extra labor that you let go actually doesn't have a higher value elsewhere, but should remain producing automobiles, while you shouldn't use those extra machines. Let me give you a real-world example. I have a friend I grew up with, married a cowboy, a real cowboy, who owned a ranch, owns a ranch in Montana, and it's a very large ranch, and they actually do have cattle drives, believe it or not. I learned all this stuff from her. Of course, she's just a Jersey girl. I can't wait to come back and shop in the malls in New Jersey, but that's another story. So I see her quite a bit. But she once called me up and she said, we have a new house. I said, oh, where'd you move to? And she says, no. She says, we have the same spot. She says, what's the term? We traded in our old house, and we had a new house put in its place. So I said, what are you talking about? Well, her house was constructed, the new house was constructed completely in a factory in Nebraska, and then was shipped in pieces, modular pieces, and put together in Montana. Okay? Well, why was that done? Well, she said it's a lot cheaper, she told me. And then it dawned on me, of course it's a lot cheaper. There's like 10 people in Montana. Okay? And the highest valued use of their time is ranching, and they farm, and wheat farming, and so on. So houses aren't constructed on site in Montana. Okay? Because the labor is so expensive, scarce and expensive. Okay? So what do? You construct houses with machinery. Okay? Now, could a planner without prices ever figure that out? I mean, to construct a house, in Siberia and ship it to the Ukraine or whatever. Okay? Construct it in Nebraska and ship it to Montana? Who would think of that except for a profit-oriented entrepreneur who's trying to cut his costs as much as possible? Okay? So that's sort of a real example. Now, something else that I want to mention is this whole idea about opportunity costs, which you've heard already, but let me quickly mention Mises' position on this. Mises admitted that you can have a planned economy at a very, very primitive low level at the level of a household or a small tribe or clan of people, okay, where production was very, very simplistic. And just to show you the example, you don't need money prices, okay, where production is simple and only has a few inputs. Let me just... So let's say, go back to the Robinson Crusoe example for a moment. Robinson Crusoe has 12 hours of labor available to him each day. Let's say he gets exhausted after that and he hangs out on the beach and whatever and goes to sleep. And he's going to allocate them in 4-hour units. Now this is his value scale, okay? The best use of the 4 hours is coconuts, next best use is fish, mushrooms, sack of berries, okay? Each one of those activities takes him 4 hours, okay? Now obviously, from what you know from my first lecture and Jeff Herberner's lecture, he would allocate the 12 hours for the first highest 3 ends, okay? The marginal utility of that labor is really the 3 pounds of mushrooms. That's the lowest end, okay? He doesn't pick berries because it's not worth it, because the benefit of the berries, which is the expected satisfaction, is lower than the benefit from the mushrooms, because that's the end that he would forego. But now let's say he finds out that he gets another production function. That is, he sees rabbits and he knows that he can trap these rabbits, okay? He can hunt the rabbits and it would cause, he would vary his diet as a result. Okay. The question then becomes, what is the cost of 4 hours spent hunting a rabbit? Okay. Well, you know what the value of the rabbit is directly to you, the expected satisfaction from consuming it, and you know what the value of the mushrooms, the lowest rank current use of your labor is, okay? And all you have to do is compare what? The value of the labor in picking mushrooms versus the value of the labor in hunting the rabbit, okay? That's easy to do. So Mises said you can directly impute value from your ends back to inputs under a very simplistic, non-capital using economy where you only have some land and some labor, okay, to combine. In a socialist economy, let's say the U.S. economy, where there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of different types of inputs, and any particular good now, in our state of technology, can be made in almost any way, okay? In that case, there's an infinity or an infinitude of possibilities of combining the resources. How do you know the one correct allocation of resources that best serves consumers without prices? You don't. You can't conduct this sort of an imputation. You have to have prices, okay? So that's, in case anyone, Mises already, in effect, anticipated this criticism that, well, what about, Robinson Crusoe? He can't calculate, but he stays alive. Okay, yeah, sure, okay? And socialism can exist for, as we'll see, for a little while, okay? Basically as sort of a parasite on previous capitalism. Okay. So what are the conclusions, at least, of this sort of introduction to what Mises said? The first is that a socialist economy is literally impossible, okay? Because it cannot calculate the opportunity cost of using any resource. There is no way for the socialist planner to know the opportunity cost. Now, even if he ignores consumer wishes, and sort of he's the ruler, okay, of the whole planet, and it's all socialist, and he has at his disposal all of the modern resources and technologies that we have, he would not even be able to figure out what to produce that he liked the most, okay, that he wanted consumers to have, right? Because he may very well find that producing certain things have a lower value than producing other things. Actually, he wouldn't find out. He wouldn't even know. He would never know. Again, socialist planning is an oxymoron because the Socialist Central Planning Board cannot plan without prices. You have to have prices. They don't plan. It's simple chaos. Okay? It's walking around in the dark and bumping into walls and so on without having the guiding light of monetary calculation. Well, I also want to, again, reiterate, that doesn't mean that the wrong things aren't continually being produced under capitalism. They are. Okay? But for the most part, those people that continually produce things that have a lower value to consumers than other things that could have been produced with those resources suffer losses and go out of business. So there's a continuing selection process going on under capitalism, selecting out the better entrepreneurs, the Bill Gates and so on, and shunting aside those entrepreneurs that make mistakes and go out of business. Some examples from the USSR. Now, the USSR was not a complete socialist economy because it could consult world prices. We'll talk a little bit more about this. Because Mises has been criticized by people simply pointing to the Soviet Union and saying, well, it lasted from 1917 to 1989. How could socialism be impossible? Okay. Well, it can and is impossible in its full sense. In the 1980s, there was a big famine in the Soviet Union, which has a tremendous amount of arable land, okay, on which you can grow crops and so on. And what we saw was, interestingly enough, rusting tractors, okay, so you had the tractors, you had fields of grain that were unharvested, okay, so these rusting tractors are sitting in the fields of grain while people are starving, and you had silos that were empty, okay, where the grain should be stored. What was the problem? Well, there were no laborers, or there weren't enough laborers. Okay, what were the laborers doing? The laborers were working in factories, making steel for the tractors that were rusting in the fields. Okay, because there wasn't any economic calculation. Okay, there was no diesel fuel being made, or not enough fuel being made, because they were selling it to the West, let's say, for hard currency, for dollars and back then German marks and so on. So under socialism, you have something called gross output planning, okay? If I can just put that here. Okay, this was the technique the Soviet Union used in deciding what and how much to produce. And the Soviet Central Planning Board was called Ghost Plan. What would be better would be no plan. Okay, you can't plan without monetary calculation. Okay, and what they did then was they set quantitative targets for outputs. They told the manager of each firm, actually they told the commissar of each industry how much output he was responsible for, and then he in turn told the managers of each of the plants in that industry how much output that they should produce. But think about that now. It's very difficult to specify all the different kinds of qualities of the product. So initially they would just specify quantitative outputs, okay, quantitative targets for the outputs. Even in the case of nails, a simple thing like nails, there's many different kinds of nails, okay, from small roofing nails, you know, to large, 10-penny nails or whatever. So what was found for a while was that there were a lot of unfinished buildings in the Soviet Union. They were standing there. They were ready for use except for the fact that there was no roofs. Okay? Roofs hadn't been put in place because the managers made very large nails because they had a quantitative target. And it was easier to meet their target by making many large nails than to try to make many more smaller nails. This was in terms of tons. So the easiest way to make it was simply to make the largest nails possible. So no roofing nails, which were smaller, no roofing nails were made, or there was a very big scarcity of roofing nails. Women couldn't find dresses in the retail shops, okay, larger women, let's say, okay. Why? Because in that case, or the other way around, I'm sorry, more petite women couldn't. Why? Because, well, they were given a certain number of dresses to make. So they made real large ones, because it was easier to meet the target that way. You met the target and you got some kind of a bonus. You didn't meet the target, you got an all-expense paid trip to the Gulag in Siberia, okay? So you wanted to meet your target, but you didn't want to, that's something else, you didn't want to exceed it too much. If you exceeded it by too much, of course, what would happen? Next year, your target would be higher, and it would be harder to meet, okay? So it was a system of mutual lying. You would say to the commissar or the industry minister, you know what, we can't make even as much as this year, okay? And he'd say, no, you're going to make more next year. So it would be a sort of, they would not, true information would never get back to the central planners, okay? And one of the Russian cartoons, very famous cartoon that was in Pravda, was this cartoon in which you have these two stick figures here. Okay, the guy with that weird kind of large fur hat, that's the commissar of the industry. He's talking to the manager of the firm, and this is a giant, this is a whole railroad train here, and this is the nail. He says, well, commissar, I've met my output target. But he made one giant nail that was like 50,000 pounds or whatever it was, because it was the easiest way to meet his target. Okay, so then they would try to change it, to more quality, to specifying quality, and then you'd make more of the smaller ones, and you'd neglect the larger ones. There was a very famous speech given by Khrushchev to the Politburo in the 1950s. He was the Russian dictator. He berated, of all producers, the producers of chandeliers. Now, by the way, who got the chandeliers? Of course, the apparatchiks, the party apparatchiks got the chandeliers. But what had been happening was that they specified the number of chandeliers to be produced in terms of pounds. So the firms responsible made very large chandeliers, and evidently they were falling from the ceilings and killing the comrades. Okay, they're pulling down the ceilings; they were so heavy. Okay. Okay. Now let me just address the whole idea of Mises's what I call the impossibility thesis. Okay, that it's impossible for a socialist. And we have to be careful to use the correct terminology. It is impossible for socialism to rationally allocate resources, meaning to allocate resources according to the highest value, either of consumers or of the planners themselves acting on behalf of the consumers. Okay? As I mentioned, one objection is the very existence of real-world socialist economies. Okay? They point out, look, the Soviet Union lasted from 1917 to 1991. Okay? So certainly it existed, but we know there were a number of reasons why the Soviet Union existed for that long. Because really the Soviet Union was a sort of a monopoly capitalist state. It was basically a state that, a firm in some sense, corrupt monopolist firm that owned all the natural resources in the country. Okay? And it did trade some of those natural resources. It traded its diamonds and electricity and steel and coal and gold on markets. So there were prices for certain goods. So it allowed them to roughly calculate. Okay. Secondly, it also just copied prices from the U.S. Once again, even though the prices will be different because scarcity conditions are different between the two economies, they gave them a rough idea of how to calculate. There was an old joke or actually a true exchange between Western economists and Soviet economists at a conference where, stemming from Khrushchev's claim, you're all too young to remember this, but some of you aren't actually, in the 1950s when he was in the UN, he took off his shoe. He was actually a pretty cool guy to watch. He was entertaining, Khrushchev. Unlike Brezhnev. He looked like he was dead, 10 years before he actually died. But Khrushchev was very animated. He banged his shoe on the table and said, "We will bury the West." Okay, so meaning they will exceed us in production and so on. And so the Soviet economists would say to the Western economists, "We will bury you, except for Hong Kong. We're going to leave Hong Kong so we can copy the prices." Okay, because they knew themselves that they needed the prices. Okay. And then there was black markets that existed between the various firms. You were supposed to just use the inputs that were allocated to you by the central plan. You weren't supposed to exchange. Okay, but in fact, there was black market exchanges. And there was a system of bribery. And there was a whole class of so-called brokers who would go to certain firms and say, "Do you need wood? Because we have extra lumber. And in return, give me steel." And these bribes are called BLAT, B-L-A-T. Okay, so, but they were really free. They were real free market prices. And then the 80s and the early 90s, I mean, when there was famine and the breakdown of production, the Soviet government began to turn its back more and more, turn a blind eye to more and more black market exchanges. I mean, there were stories of Beatles albums selling for $100 and American jeans for $300, right on the streets of Moscow, right in Red Square. Okay. And there was also a story, I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, that back at the end of the 50s, the Chinese government ordered 500 Sears catalogs, Okay, so they could have some prices, have some idea of prices for the consumers' goods they're producing. Now, there was a period in which there was true communism, and that's the period of war communism in the Soviet Union. That only lasted from 1917 to 1921, after which Vladimir Lenin, the Soviet dictator, then turned to a quasi-free market for a while called the New Economic Policy, because everything had completely broken down in Russia during that period. Cities were disappearing, literally, because people were breaking up their houses, first their furniture, then their houses to keep warm. Okay? And then when there was no place to live, they went into the countryside to forage for food and so on. Factories were being literally dismantled hour by hour as people stole parts of the machinery and so on, because there were absolutely no prices. No prices were allowed. There was no accounting system. There was only the central plan. So basically, if socialism is applied consistently to a closed economy like the planet Earth, for example, then what will happen ultimately is what happened in Pol Pot's Cambodia. Another example. Okay, the cities will just disappear, and all you'll have is nomadic bands of predators, okay, fighting one another. That's what socialism leads to. Complete breakdown of the division of labor. You cannot have any sort of a complex division of labor without monetary calculation. Okay. So Pol Pot wasn't excessive. I mean, Pol Pot was a true socialist. Okay. It's simply bloody, and the more bloodthirsty you are, the more you can impose your dictates, the closer you'll come to true socialism. Okay, which is basically just roving bands who can't calculate and just trying to live off the land. Okay, I did want to mention also Mises' point that I made before. If you really can't impute values directly from consumer demands, okay, how is it that subjective values, which we know is at the central of, at the center of every economy, okay, how is it that these values are transformed? Okay, and they're subjective values. They're transformed into objective numbers, prices, that are meaningful and that represent scarcity. And Mises said, well, it can't be done by one mind. That's the problem with socialism. It can't be done by one mind. Okay? There has to be a social process. And he used the term appraisement process. I added the term social appraisement process to indicate that to be more than one mind involved. So basically, the entrepreneur is at the center. Okay. Now, the entrepreneur faces two markets, or two sets of markets, or the entrepreneurs. First of all, they have to buy resources. Okay. So they have certain experience with previous prices, but they don't use previous prices when they calculate. Okay. What they do is first they look at the future. Okay. What are the future prices of consumer goods? If I'm deciding to come up with a new game system, video game system, well then it might take me 2 years to develop that. I have to know what's going to occur in the interim. That requires understanding based on experience. Okay, just think of for a moment of Bill Gates versus, I think his name was Watson, the CEO in the early 1980s of IBM. Watson, had the technology for the personal computer, but Watson told his executives and so on that personal computers will only be sort of sophisticated video game systems. They'll never catch on in business. They'll never replace the mainframe. In the early 1980s, he said this. But then we had Stephen Jobs and his partner. Name escapes me for the moment, and they did not believe that. They believed that there was an application for these personal computers in business. Well, they were correct. Okay, they went on to be a very successful company. Okay, there was a setback or two here and there. Okay, and then others jumped on the bandwagon. Initially, Compaq and a few other firms began producing these PCs. As I mentioned before, by 1990, IBM lost $8 billion in 1990 and $5 billion in 91. Okay, well, that might be reversed, but they lost $13 billion in 2 years. Why? Because of the decisions they made, because of poor forecasting of the future in the early 80s. So they continued to make these mainframes. And let's say by the time they were selling them in 1989, 1990, they were, let's say, selling for $3 million. But it may have cost $4 or $5 million. Okay, so that's how you lose money, okay, by poor forecasting. So the point is then, so you have entrepreneurs all trying to figure out what future price of different consumers' goods will be in each of their industries. But what brings them together and makes them the representatives of the consumer is the fact that they then bid quantities of money for resources. Okay, they all bid against one another, okay, in all different industries to get labor, to get energy, to get steel, and so lumber, and so on and on. So that what happens is that there's a whole structure of resource prices. At any moment, right now, everything has a price. Everything's owned by someone and has a price and is either for sale or not at that price. And they can then calculate their costs and then compare it to what they believe is going to be the future prices of consumer goods. So the entrepreneurs are only an intermediary. They do not run production. They respond, okay, to the forces of scarcity, okay, of resources, and to future consumers. They are the representatives of consumers in the future. Right? Now, at the same time, at every moment, they're also selling what they produced in the past. So they're getting some kind of feedback on these decisions of the past. But the point is that they don't use those prices automatically and assume that they're going to be what the prices should be in the future. Okay? It's a very difficult job. Many fail. More succeed because the market does weed out the failures. Okay? Okay. So that's what we call a social appraisement process. That's what socialism cannot reproduce. Okay? Mises calls this the intellectual division of labor. He says everyone is involved in monetary calculation. In the decisions you make as consumers, by going out and making a purchase, you are then part of the process of establishing the prices of consumer goods. Okay? And as a worker who sells resources to firms, or as the owner of a firm who buys those resources, you're also involved. Everyone is involved together. Everybody's value scales and expectations of the future interact on the market at every moment, and that brings about this great system of monetary calculation. Now, one mind cannot reproduce that, no matter how clever, how smart, whether they're Einstein or whoever. They can't reproduce that. Why? Because there are no markets. No one's competing against one another. Okay? They're sole owners. So at some point, Mises makes a nice statement here about socialism. He says, socialism is a problem of volition, of one will acting. It's not a problem of knowledge, as we mentioned. Remember, they can get the technological knowledge. Okay, they can extract all of the laws of science from their scientists and so on. Okay, they get all this advice, but they can't reproduce monetary calculation. Okay, let me go through some of the criticisms of Mises. Mises' contribution on this. Okay. The initial criticisms to his article, which again was published in 1920, they're more or less very, very naive. Okay, and they came from the Germans. Okay, because the article was published in Germany, it really didn't get any notoriety or didn't get any notice in English-speaking countries until the 1930s. So some of the German socialists that responded came up with real crazy responses. For example, one of them, named Otto Neurath, who was just a big mouth, who was in the same seminar with Mises in boehm-bawerk's seminar, and Mises said he knew nothing. He just kept ranting and raving in the seminar. But boehm-bawerk was too nice to to smack him upside the head and tell him to keep quiet. He said, "What's the problem?" He says, "Why don't we just have accounting in natural units, what he called natural units." Now, what does that mean? Why don't we just add up tons of steel, hours of kilowatts of energy, and so on? Okay, so he was making a basic mistake trying to add apples and oranges. So Mises easily disposed of that. In fact, he had already, in anticipation of that argument, he had already demolished it in the original article. he said you cannot, accounting requires a common denominator. Okay, so you have to have some sort of money. Okay, then the second, well, let me just say, no. So the second thing that was response to Mises was, well, what about if we calculate in labor hours? They're homogeneous. Okay. Well, in fact, they're not homogeneous. Okay. Is the hour of let's say a cashier at McDonald's worth as much as the hour of a brain surgeon? Of course, they're different. Okay. Is the hour of Michael Jordan's time when he played basketball on the court equal to an hour of the 12th man sitting on the bench in the NBA? No, of course not. Even though they're both basketball players, there's different qualities. So that solution doesn't take into account the fact that there are different scarcities even among laborers. Secondly, with that, it also leaves out of account the fact that capital is scarce and land is scarce. Okay, so if you just count labor hours, you're going to misallocate capital and land, and you're going to have a very, very uneconomic production. Finally, we all know that the more, even taking the same laborer, if that laborer works only with, let's say, a horse and a plow, as was the case 200 years ago in the United States, their productivity is going to be much less than laborers that work with computerized tractors today, okay? Even given the same skills. So it doesn't take that into account. The third response in the German language was, well, we'll tell every socialist manager the day that capitalism ends, the very next day when you come in, do the same thing that you did the day before. We'll just keep the same managers. Do the same thing. Just keep doing it. So that'll be fine. Okay? Well, of course, that's ridiculous. Okay? Because that assumes what we call a static state. That assumes that people's value scales never change. They never have desires for new goods and lose desires for other goods. It assumes that technology never changes. It assumes that resources are never depleted and new ones discovered. It assumes that labor skills never change. Okay? In fact, so it's not a problem if you really do live in a static state, but that's not the real world. Okay? We live in a world of continual change, uncertain change. So the whole point of having monetary calculation is to continually adapt the production structure, the structure of what you're producing, the allocation of resources, to changing market conditions. Okay? That's what makes us grow. That's what makes us rich. There's always more and more capital being, except that the government interferes, more and more capital being saved up and invested, and you need to allocate that capital to the various areas or branches of production which best satisfy consumers. Okay. All right. Now, more sophisticated responses to Mises came from the British socialists, okay, and American socialists. These economists were trained in the neoclassical tradition. They did know economics, okay, but their focus, because in the 1930s, general equilibrium theory came into more and more use. They thought of the economy as sort of a system of managers running firms in an economy which was not changing much. So since I only have 5 minutes, I'll just briefly go through this. First of all, there was a mathematical solution. Okay. An Italian economist, Italian economist, and then his disciple, okay, Vilfredo Pareto, and then his disciple Enrico Barone, Swedish economist Gustav Cassel, and the British economist Dickinson came up with this. They said, look, all the information that we need, value scales, resources, and technology, can be included in a system of simultaneous equations. Okay, and then we can solve this system, and it will tell us the right prices and the right quantities for all goods and services. Okay, and there you can look at this if you look at a book by George Halm called Economic Systems. He has about 6 pages showing what they actually can do, or actually how they go about doing it. But basically, Barone, who was the first one to come up with this sort of solution, or at least was commenting on the first solution by his teacher, pointed out that, yeah, you can do it on paper and you can solve the equations, but it doesn't tell you anything about the real world. Okay. Now, the British socialist economists in the 1930s claimed that Barone had refuted Mises in advance. Well, they didn't read his whole article. He said, sure, it'll work given the assumptions of a static economy and an economy where everybody knows everything about production and so on, but it won't work in the real world. Okay. Then there was a trial and error method, which is also called market socialism. And what that said was basically that one way of solving the problem was to go about, to have a central planning board, set prices of inputs, set prices of consumer goods. Okay? And if the prices were too high of consumer goods, well, then that would mean that or rather, if there was consumer goods piling up in the factories and in the warehouses, that means you set the price too high. You just lower the prices. And then the same thing is true of the inputs. If there was a shortage of the inputs, prices were too low. But if they were piling up, they were too high. So just adjust the price to make supply equal to demand. Isn't that what happens in the market economy? Okay, that was their point. Right. And then instruct the managers to act as if those prices are real prices and that they should strive to set their costs at a minimum. Not earn profits, but set their costs at a minimum. Combine resources so you have minimum cost of production. And that will solve the problem of not being able to calculate. Okay. So it was supposedly, even better than perfect competition, or better than competition and capitalism, because under this system you wouldn't have monopolies. Okay, so that was sort of the trial and error method. Okay. Basically, a number of people responded to all of this. What Mises pointed out was, first, regarding the mathematical solution, that, well, you have a number of different things, the value scales, the capital, the labor, the land, okay, or natural resources, and you have technology. And he said, even if all of these things stay constant, still, people have to continually change the capital over time, because you've made investments that were wrong, that were not the correct investments. So if all of these things happen in the present period, okay, Mises said that you can solve the equations for the present period, but that you're just doing the same thing then. You're producing the same goods. You're not taking into account that mistakes have been made in producing the various factories and so on. So what he says is that capital and value scales cannot remain the same. That is, as you change your capital to the future point, okay, to serve consumer demands, people are going to have different goods. Their value scales, their margin utilities will change, and in fact, they'll have different values. So your solution today is completely irrelevant to changing production in a way that best serves consumers. Okay, even if nothing else changes. Okay, as long as there are errors. And then regarding socialism, market socialism, which Mises called the quasi-market, he simply said that this is really playing market. Okay, it's like kids playing market. Because who sets up the rules for this? Okay, yes, you tell the managers to minimize their costs. You make up these prices. Okay, but the point is, should you even be producing those goods? Under capitalism, you have entrepreneurs who go out of business, who start new firms, who merge firms. The managers aren't going to be able to do that. Mises' point was that capitalism is not a managerial system. It's an entrepreneurial system. The entrepreneurs risk their very destiny by investing in firms. They may make mistakes or they may be correct. Okay? They're driven by profit and loss. That does not exist in this trial and error method. In fact, there's only one firm that owns everything, and they set up these arbitrary rules, and under those rules, they get to set of arbitrary prices that have no meaning in the real world. Okay, and I will stop there. Thank you.